All right, let's get started with this morning. First of all, thanks for being here this morning. Good to see you all, and to everyone joining us online. Hello to all of you out there. I'm excited to be with you guys this morning. And let's dive in. It's October. Anyone love October? October is officially my second favorite month of the year. My favorite is December because I am just Christmas crazy. I love Christmas. But a close second is October. I'm a big fan of Halloween and all the fun. If you guys get a chance to drive past my house, I have some crazy decorations up and everything. But I wanted to start by talking about a movie. How many people have seen this movie, The Nightmare Before Christmas? Good, it's a classic, a Disney movie, a little different than the typical Disney movie, a little spooky, kind of fun. It's a Halloween movie, it's a Christmas movie, it's a little bit of both. But for anyone who hasn't seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, it's a really fun movie about Jack Skellington, and he is the king of Halloween. He's almost like the Santa Claus of Halloween. And so in The Nightmare Before Christmas, it tells about how all the holidays happen, and there's these different towns that are in charge of making the different holidays happen, and Jack Skellington is the king of Halloween Town, and so they make Halloween happen year after year, and the movie picks up with they just had a successful Halloween, but Jack is feeling a little down. He's feeling like life is a little repetitive, and he's kind of just discontent in his current circumstances, and he feels just kind of bored of the same old thing year after year, and he's just kind of longing for more. He wants some change in his life. And so he goes on this long walk into the woods where he stumbles across these trees, and on these trees are these doors that lead to all the different holiday towns. And he's intrigued by this door that has a Christmas tree on it. And he looks at it, and it's sparkly. He's like, ooh. So he opens it, and he falls into Christmas Town. And there's snow, and everyone is happy and joyful. And it's completely different than anything that he's ever seen. It's the complete opposite of Halloween Town. It's joy and lights, and everyone's happy, and these smells in the air. And he has found something that he's been longing for. And he says, ooh, I want to make Christmas this year. So he comes back to Halloween Town and tells everyone about these wonderful things he found in Halloween Town. And so he decides, instead of doing Halloween, this year we are going to make Christmas. Christmas is going to be ours this time. And so he puts all the citizens of Halloween Town in charge of planning Christmas. They eventually capture Santa Claus and tell him that they're giving him the year off and that they're going to make Christmas this year. And so Jack makes a Santa Claus suit. They make all these toys, and then they go out. He flies out on Christmas Eve and begins doing Santa's job for him. And he ends up ruining Christmas because their version of Christmas was creepy and scary. And the people began waking up in the middle of the night and finding all these scary toys running around this house. And they call the police, and the military shoots Jack out of the air, and he ends up ruining Christmas. And eventually, Santa comes, and he saves the day. Now, why do I tell you the story of a Disney movie? Well, the reason why is, as funny as it sounds, I feel like this year, I can really relate to Jack Skellington. And that might sound weird, but I bet a lot of you could, too. I've been battling a lot of discontentment this year. I know at the beginning of this year, it seems like there's almost been some themes of this year, especially starting with March. You know, there was a lot of uncertainty about the future as we faced this virus. There was some fear, there was some anxiety, and as time went on, I feel like for me, a lot of it just moved to discontentment. I got bored of the same old thing. I got sick of just sitting around and being quarantined and not being able to go to church and be with my youth group and stand on the stage and preach, and I just grew really discontent. Does anyone remember 15 days to slow the curve? Anyone remember that? 15 days to slow the curve? Well, welcome to 15 days to slow the curve, day 209. 209. That was 209 days ago. It was like forever ago. And have you guys heard this? How many times have you heard, once we get back to normal, once things get back to normal, once we get back, I hear it over and over and over again. And it's like the bar just keeps moving of when we're going to get back to normal. Once we get back to normal, and the bar just seems to keep moving. So I'm preaching this message to you this morning because it's been a message that I have been preaching to myself for the past 7 months. And as I've kind of battled through this discontentment, this is kind of what I've learned. I feel like discontentment is a subtle trap that the enemy sets by turning our focus to the things that we lack, which allows him to lead us into ruin and destruction. Discontentment makes us vulnerable to temptation. It stunts your spiritual growth. It leeches on your faith. It drains your hope and empties your life of joy. Now, I know that sounds like a big statement there. It can seem kind of dreary, some doom and gloom, but we're going to go back through the scripture. I'm just going to point out how I kind of came to this conclusion and how God has kind of taught me this over the past few months. If you have a Bible with you, would you flip to 1 Timothy? We're going to pick up in chapter 6 this morning, 1 Timothy. If you're having any trouble finding it, let me help you out. It's right before 2 Timothy, if that helps. 1 Timothy chapter 6. I got it up here on the screen this morning for anyone who doesn't have a Bible with you. Verse 6 through 10 says this, "But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunges people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. For some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with with all kinds of griefs. So now you can flip over to Exodus chapter 15, and that's where we're going to be hanging out this morning. That warning that Paul gives us is so big. I think a lot of times we think discontentment, it's not big, it's not bad, it's not that scary. But Paul gives this strong warning against discontentment. That it's not just this little thing that'll kind of drag you down. It'll kind of, make you feel less happy. Or even as far as more than just making you live in this kind of state of gloom. It is so much more than that. He tells us that discontentment is a trap. It's a trap. It makes us vulnerable to temptation. It leads people into harmful desire, and it plunges them into ruin and destruction. That's a strong warning. And he says that if we pursue these things, if we pursue money, if we pursue the things of the world, it will lead us into all kinds of grief. So this morning we're going to hang out in the book of Exodus, chapter 15 through 17. But before we dive into it, I kind of want to give you a little bit of a background on what's happening in this chapter, or in these chapters here. So in the book of Exodus, we find that God's people were living in captivity, they're living in slavery, and they're being horribly mistreated. They were being worked tirelessly. The Egyptians made it their goal to make God's people just miserable. They wanted to make sure that they didn't continue to prosper. They were worried about how much they were prospering, and they began to feel threatened. So the Pharaoh puts them into slavery, works them hard, makes sure that if they have any babies, that they're thrown into the Nile River. So they're facing this horrible, horrible oppression. But God had a plan for his people. He was going to lead them out of this slavery using a man named Moses who would lead them into a new life. And so when we see Moses rise up and answer the call that God had placed on his life, the Pharaoh will not relent. He is not simply giving in. And so God begins to unleash these plagues on Egypt, and things get pretty crazy. There's this plague where the whole Nile River turned to blood. And all the fish died, and it began to stink, and it smelled horrible. And we see as each of these plagues come, the Pharaoh looks like he's going to tap out, like, no, okay, we give up. But then he changes his mind. So when the Pharaoh doesn't relent, the plagues continue, and then there's this plague of frogs. Frogs come up out of the Nile River, and just a total invasion of frogs. Frogs everywhere. Frogs lining the streets, in their houses, in their beds. The world, everything in Egypt is just covered in frogs. And then after the frogs, there were gnats, this invasion of gnats. Gnats covered people, they covered the animals, gnats everywhere you looked. And then after the gnats, there were flies. Flies covered the land, and flies everywhere. Then after the flies, all the livestock dropped dead. Can you imagine that? All the animals just dropped dead. Then after the livestock, there were boils. Boils break out. All the Egyptians break out in these horrible boils. And then there was hail. Hail begins to just pound down, and there was these storms of lightning and hail, and the hail just destroyed everything, destroyed their fields, and just wrecked the place, this crazy hailstorm. And then there was locusts. It says that the locusts were so thick that you couldn't see the ground. The ground, locusts everywhere. It says that the locusts devoured everything that the hail left behind, that there was nothing green left in Egypt. The locusts just destroyed everything. And then there was darkness. For 3 days straight, there was darkness. And then finally, the plague of the firstborn. And the firstborn of every Egyptian died. So things got really, really rough, and eventually the Pharaoh surrenders and says, okay, go, take the Israelites, leave, go away from here, get away from us. And so Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and God had came through for them. As we go through this story, I want you to picture that you're there. Okay, I want you to hear the story, but I want you to picture it as someone who's living through it. Imagine that you're one of God's people, and you see him unleashing these crazy plagues. You're living in slavery, and then God unleashes these incredible plagues. I want you to picture that you're here in this story. So finally, you've been set free. You're exiting it. You're leaving, and God has just done this miraculous thing to lead you out. And so now God goes ahead of them. And it says that he led them. God literally went ahead of them and led them. He led them by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. So God is literally guiding and directing their every step. He's going ahead of them. And then eventually the Pharaoh decides to pursue them. And so they get together these chariots and these horsemen, and they begin pursuing them. And they reach the Red Sea. And Moses stretches out his arms over the Red Sea, and the sea opens. And the Israelites walk right through the sea on dry land. Imagine this. You've just exited Egypt, where you've been living in slavery, and now you're being pursued, but God is leading you, and you get to the Red Sea, and then the sea opens, and you walk through it on dry land. There's water on your left. There's water on your right. Just these walls of waters as you walk through a sea. And so they walk right through the sea on dry land. And as the Egyptians came in to pursue them, the water crashes in and destroys them. Isn't that unbelievable to think about it? To think of it of the perspective of what it must have been like to be there and to live through it. And so that's where we're going to pick up this morning, okay? I want you to know what they've been through. I want you to know the ends that God has gone through to prove his love to them and to show that he's got them in his hands, that he's got them, that he loves them, that he cares for them. That's where we're going to pick up this story. So we've just lived through this incredible experience, right? You've seen how God has come through for you, how far he'll go, what crazy extents he'll go to rescue his people. And when we pick up Exodus 15, it starts with Moses and the Israelites are singing these songs of worship, and that's exactly the right response after just what they've seen, what God has gone through, or what God has done for them and what they've gone through. They're singing these songs, and they're saying that the Lord is my strength. The Lord is a warrior. He opened the sea and destroyed our enemies. There is no one like him. There is no one so holy. There is no one so awesome. He can do anything. The love of the Lord is unfailing for us. He reigns forever and ever. And then 3 days later, they're grumbling. 3 days later, they're complaining. 3 days later, they find themselves totally discontent. In just 3 days. They're walking, and then we get to verse 24, and the Israelites are like, Moses, we're thirsty. There's no 7-Eleven out here. We want Slurpees. It's hot, right? Like, there's nothing to drink. There was this water, but the water was too bitter to drink. And so 3 days in, they're complaining, there's nothing to drink. This is terrible. And so God tells Moses, hey, I want you to take this piece of wood, throw it into the water. Moses takes the piece of wood, throws the wood in the water. All of a sudden, the water becomes fresh for them to drink. Another miracle. Throw wood in the water, and now the water's good to drink. So they all get their drinks, and now we're happy again. And then we move along in the story. We get to chapter 16, and they continue to travel. But before long, Moses, we're hungry. Moses, I'm so hungry. There hasn't been a Taco Bell in like so long. We're so hungry, Moses. Feed us. We're so hungry. They become so discontent. Listen to this. Just think about how crazy this is. This is chapter 16, verse 3. They say, if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. There we sat around pots filled with meat and ate and all the bread that we wanted. But now you have brought us out into the wilderness to starve us all to death. Doesn't that sound crazy to say? Like they were living in slavery, a horrible oppression, killing their children if they had them, working them, not just they were their servants and they kind of did some housework. Their goal was to make them miserable. The goal was to make them stop prospering. And now they've been set free after seeing all these miracles. But we're hungry. Why didn't God just kill us? Their discontentment led them to say this crazy thing. And so what does God do? He makes it rain bread. He makes it rain bread. God rained down manna from heaven. He gives them bread that falls from the sky. How incredible is, picture that. Starts raining bread. I'm hungry. All right, I'll make it rain bread. Incredible. And then quail came and filled their camps. And they're looking like, what is this? And Moses tells them that the Lord has provided for us. The Lord has provided for us. But he tells them, I want you to take just enough for today. Don't go hoard it all up and store. Take just enough for today. Take just what you need for today. Don't store it up. But some people didn't listen. They're like, hey, we got the bread. We're taking it. But overnight it spoiled and it was filled with maggots and it began to smell. God provided for them daily. So then the next day, guess what happens? It rains down bread from heaven. And this continues to happen. But then we get to the 6th day. And on the 6th day, Moses told them something different. He said, today I want you to take double, because tomorrow is the Sabbath. Tomorrow we're going to rest. So I want you to take and gather double today. And that's exactly what they did. But that night, the bread did not spoil. It was good to the next day. They took and they cooked what they wanted, and they made it, and they prepared it. So then on the Sabbath day that they could rest. So after all these days, it spoiled at night. But on the 6th day, it lasted till the 7th day. But some people still went out on the 7th day looking for the bread. Where's the manna at? And Moses is like, are you guys kidding me? Like, how long will you refuse to keep my commands? I imagine he's like, have you not seen how God has been providing for us? Have you not been living through what I've been living through and seeing what God's been doing? That we're still not going to do what he tells us to say. We're going to come out on the 7th day when he's asked us to rest. We're going to come out and try and store it. We're going to store too much when he's told us to take what we need. And he's given it to us every day. And now he said to take double, and we took it, and it's good. But now we're still coming out and looking for more. How long will you refuse to obey my commands? You got to be kidding me. And so God continued to provide for them day after day. For 40 years, it rained down manna. Incredible. Now we move into chapter 17. And in chapter 17, we find that they begin grumbling again. Now they're thirsty again. Verse 2. Moses, we're thirsty. I'm thirsty, Moses. This is getting rough. Give us some water, Moses. Chapter 17, verse 3. Real quick before we read this, look at this. This is their complaint. Chapter 16, verse 3. Now we move into 17, verse 3. Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst? I thought that was kind of funny as I was reading that. Verse 16, verse 3, they said, why didn't God just kill us? 17, verse 3, they say, why did you bring us out here just to let us die? And so Moses, God tells him, see that rock? Go hit it with your staff. And Moses hits this rock with his staff, and the rock begins spitting out fresh water. Another miracle. They had another need. God provided another miracle. Now, this is where I kind of want to stop and go through and pick this story apart. So we started by talking about these the strong warnings, this strong warning that Paul gave us against discontentment. It's not just going to kind of steal some happiness. It's not going to just kind of make you feel sad. It's not just bad vibes. It's a trap that the enemy will use to lead you to ruin and lead you to destruction. It is so much worse than just a bad feeling or a bad emotion or thinking negatively. It's so much more than that. He tells us about the destruction that will come to those who don't heed these warnings. So, how do we avoid discontentment? I think the biggest thing, the first step, is to identify the source. So when you look at the Israelites and all that they've been through, I kind of feel like if I were there, I would have been fearless. I would have been totally content no matter the circumstances. You think that they would have been filled with faith. You think that they would have never been worrying about anything. You think about what they lived through, these crazy plagues, the Red Sea opened, raining down bread from heaven, water coming from a rock, threw a stick in the water became. You would think that if you were ever in need, you wouldn't be thinking, I have a need. You'd be thinking, oh man, we have a need. What's God going to do this time? What's he going to do this time? Every time we've had a need before, he's done something crazy. I can't wait to see what God's going to do. But no. Anytime they had a need, anytime they didn't have everything they wanted, grumbling, complaining. Why did God let this happen? Why has God brought us here to let us die? Why didn't he just kill us back in Egypt? Doesn't that just sound like the most ridiculous thing to say? Maybe it's because we didn't read through it, but when I look at this story, I'm like, that sounds insane. You think about it. You guys just lived through this horrible oppression. God has proved his love for you, unleashes these plagues, opens the Red Sea, and then he's just going to lead you out to the desert and then be like, all right, you can die now. No, that doesn't make any sense. It would not make any sense for God not to provide for them. It wouldn't make any sense for God to not meet their needs because everything he's done leading up to this point has proven who he is. So God must have just changed and stopped caring about us, and now he's going to let us die this time, right? It doesn't make any sense at all, but that's the thing, is that discontentment doesn't make sense. Discontentment does not make sense. Once we know who God is, once we understand what he is capable of, and once we know the crazy love that he has for us, we no longer have a reason to be discontent. We no longer have a reason to question him. Discontentment doesn't really make sense anymore. When we know that God is sovereign over everything, and when we know that he is a perfect father who loves us and cares for us, when we know that he never leaves us, he never forsakes us, that he is with us through the things we go through in life, and we know that his presence is around us, the discontentment no longer makes sense. So why is it we're so often led back into that trap? Why is it that the Israelites were so easily led back into this trap after all the amazing miracles they had experienced? When we pick up in chapter 15, they're worshiping God. They're declaring the praises of how mighty and powerful he was. They're declaring who he was and all that he had done for them. And then their focus shifts off of who God was and all that God had provided for them. And their focus shifts to what they were currently lacking. That's when discontentment creeps in. Discontentment creeps in when we stop focusing on who our God is, the love that he has for us, and how he's provided for us. And our focus turns to what I'm currently lacking. My focus is what I'm currently lacking. That's exactly what happened to the Israelites. Time and time again, their focus was not on, whoa, remember what God did? What's he going to do now? I can't wait. They're not living in this anticipation of what God might do. They're just focused on what I'm currently lacking. Right now I'm thirsty. Right now I'm hungry. And I think that this is the reason that the enemy so often tries to lead us into discontentment. Because just like Paul said, the result is ruin and destruction. But when we think about it, it doesn't seem like this big, bad, yucky, got to avoid sin, like run away from discontent. It can seem like, I'm just not real happy with the way things are going right now. I just wish I had a little bit more. I just wish that this was different. I just wish I had this. It seems like these little things. It's this little subtle things that the enemy uses to take our focus off of God and how he's provided for us and who he is, and just let it simmer on the things that we're currently lacking. I think that discontentment is a slippery slope. We're not just all of a sudden drowning in a life filled with discontentment. The enemy doesn't lead us to a diving board into the deep end of this pool of discontentment. He brings us over to this nice little water slide. He says, hey, hop on the water slide, focusing on these little things we lack. And then he just gives us a little push. And we slowly creep down this slide until, boom, we're plunged into the same pool of discontentment. It's this slippery slope. It's this subtle thing that the enemy uses. Now, guys, I gotta tell you something. You guys know I'm the youth pastor here. So I spend most of my time preaching to middle schoolers and high schoolers. And I'm always trying to come up with creative ways to teach the scripture. I'm always trying to come up with something creative and memorable so that it'll stick. Something that helps them remember it. And so I'm going to be a youth pastor for a moment. So that means I'm going to need you guys to sink down to a middle school level for a moment. Can we do that? Okay. It's about to get real immature up in here. Okay. So I just need you to brace yourselves. Okay. Lower yourself down to that middle school level. And it's going to sound real immature, but I promise you're never going to forget what I'm about to say. You ready for this? Let's talk about passing gas for a minute, okay? I told you. Passing gas. Gas exits the body in so many ways, right? Sometimes it's really loud and everyone looks and everyone laughs, but sometimes it's quiet and you don't hear a thing. But then all of a sudden, you smell something real bad, right? Does anyone know what this is called? Anybody? Silent but deadly, okay? Silent but deadly. Everyone knows it. Some of you guys acted like, I have no idea what you're talking about. No, silent but deadly, right? It's silent, but all of a sudden, clear the room. Silent but deadly. Just like gas can be silent but deadly, discontentment is subtle but deadly. Discontentment is subtle but deadly. It does not seem like this big, bad, gotta run from, I have these thoughts about what I'm currently lacking, and I wish I had this, and I wish that this was different. I gotta stay away from that. That's gonna bring ruin and destruction into my life. This is gonna leach the joy out of my life. This is gonna drain me of hope. No, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like these little these little thoughts about, I wish this was different, little grumblings, little complainings. But discontentment is subtle but deadly. The enemy sets this trap by leading us to focus on the things that we're lacking. And it takes our focus completely away from who our God is, the crazy love that he has for us, and all the ways that he's provided for us. And so the problem with discontentment is that a lot of times it seems like we're aiming it at maybe our circumstances. Maybe we're aiming it at people in our lives. Maybe we're just aiming at the things we're not happy about, the things that we wish we could change. But ultimately, our discontentment is aimed at God. You see it in the Israelites. They're complaining about water. They're complaining about food. But ultimately, they're saying, why did God do this to us? Why did God bring me into these circumstances? Why did he allow this to happen? Why did he do this? So he uses this discontentment to subtly set this trap, to focus on what we lack. But ultimately, it's aimed at God because God, ultimately, he's sovereign, right? He's over it all. He is in it all. He has a plan for us. He loves for us. He loves us. And so the enemy wants to come in and distract us from that truth. So it's this subtle trap. So we got to be hyper aware that we are not starting to slip down the devil's water slide. So the Israelites grew discontent anytime they met adversity, right? Everything is going good and God's providing for them. They're singing the songs of worship, but, ooh, we're thirsty. Doom and gloom. Ah, we're hungry. Doom and gloom, right? This discontentment comes in and it leads us to doubt. It leads us to fear. It leads us into anxiety. It's this trap that brings all these different things into our lives. And the enemy almost uses it as like this wedge into our relationship with God. These little thoughts of where we're putting our focus leads our thoughts away from God. It leads our thoughts away from being thankful for how he's provided for us. It leads us to this doubt and this fear and this anxiety. There's this moment in the story that I just love, and that's when Moses tells them to take just enough for today. Take just enough for today. Why would he say that? Take just enough for today. I think it's because these guys had short-term memory loss, right? They every time they met some adversity, they forgot about who God was and all he had done for them. They just thought, I'm hungry, I'm going to die, right? That's like my kids. We're hungry, we're going to die, feed us, right? And God provided for them daily so that they wouldn't forget him, so that they would learn to depend on him daily. And this is something that's repeated throughout Scripture. We started with this verse this morning, and it says, if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Jesus said in Matthew 16, verse 34, therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. When Jesus taught the disciples to pray, he taught them to pray this, give us today our daily bread. It's this theme that's repeated about God will provide for us today. God will carry us today. And that's exactly what God did. I mean, he literally provided for them daily bread. Bread rained down from heaven. So he told them, don't worry about tomorrow. God will provide for you tomorrow. And he did, and he's proven it each step of the way. But some of them are like, I don't know. We got the bread today. Who knows what tomorrow might bring? It's right here. Let's gather it. Let's store it up. Moses said, no, don't do that. We're going to depend on the Lord today. And tomorrow, guess what we're going to do? We're going to depend on the Lord today. Day by day, we're going to depend on the Lord to provide for us today. And so many of us get caught up in tomorrow and the future and what's going to happen and how is this situation going to work out? And God, what are you going to do here? And God, how could you possibly solve this? And he's saying, hey, I'm giving you bread today. Count on me today. We'll worry about tomorrow tomorrow. Today has enough worry of its own. Give us today our daily bread. Worry about tomorrow tomorrow. A thing that I think is so dangerous about discontentment is I think it creates this fog in our lives. When we're constantly focusing on what we're lacking, it creates this fog and it leads us to make decisions based on our discontentment and not based off wisdom. And this is something that I've been guilty of, and I've seen so many people fall into this same trap. We get so focused on the things that we lack, and then we just start making these decisions out of this fogged discontentment, which leads us into foolishness rather than wisdom. I see it all the time, right? A lot of people got piles of debt because they made decisions based off discontentment rather than wisdom. I know that I vowed to love my spouse till the day I die, for better, for worse, rich or poor, sickness and health, but I'm just not happy anymore. I'm just not happy anymore. Discontentment makes this fog that leads us to this foolishness, and people do it with decisions with work, decision with finances, decisions with church, all across the board. When we're making decisions and living out of a place of discontentment, the enemy loves it because he's created this fog. And what happens if you run around in fog? What happens if you drive around fast in fog? You hit things, you get banged up, you get some bumps and bruises. Have you ever heard someone say, failure is not an option? The tough guys like this, failure is not an option. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, okay? I'm here to tell you, failure is always an option. Not even just that it's always an option, and it's always an option, but it's always the easiest option also. Failure is always an option, is always the easiest option. So many times, we avoid the discomfort of adversity. And we just choose failure because it's easy. It's the easy way out. Our discontentment leads us to failure constantly because it avoids making wise decisions. It avoids overcoming the adversity because we're just focused on, I just want it to be different. I just want this to change. I just want more. I just want this. I just want to fix this. And it leads us into this discontentment. It creates this fog. And it leads us to make these foolish decisions. It's easier just to lie in this situation than try and explain the truth. It's easier just to go into the debt. It's easier just to end this relationship than to try and fix this conflict. That might be uncomfortable and that might get weird. It's easier just to get divorced and just move on than to try and go to counseling and fix these problems and I'm not happy. It's the easy way out. So many of us fail constantly because failure is always the easiest option. Discontentment leads us to this, and that's what happened with the Israelites. Every time they look ahead and they see adversity, every time they find themselves a little uncomfortable, they were God's chosen people. A part of one of the greatest stories that had ever been told. They witnessed insane miracles, and they spent so much of the time discontent. So how do we overcome this discontentment? That's the question. In Philippians 4, verse 13, a verse that probably so many of you have heard, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You've probably heard this verse from, athletes and, performers and things like that. I can do all through Christ who gives me strength. But the problem is that's not really what this verse is saying. Evidence because I cannot throw a ball like Tom Brady. I cannot knock out Mike Tyson. I cannot dunk on LeBron James, unfortunately. And obviously, that's not what this verse is saying. Paul is not talking about Jesus as some sort of performance enhancer. He's talking about him as a source of contentment. If you back up just a couple verses, we find the truth to what Paul's really saying. And for some context, he's writing this from a Roman prison. And the believers on the outside are worried about Paul. Oh man, it's rough in there, Paul. Oh, we're worried about you. And Paul writes this. He says, I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret to being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. See, Paul is saying, don't worry about me. I know my circumstances look bad, but I have found the secret to being content no matter what's going on. So Paul shows us that contentment is not conditional. It's not based off our circumstances. If we just fix that one little thing, or we just move on for this, or get rid of that, or solve that problem, or get a little more, then I'll be content. No. He says, you can be content regardless of the circumstances. And that's the secret that he's learned. It's not based off conditions. You either got it or you don't. In March, when this whole thing happened and we went into quarantine, at first I felt a strong sense of purpose. I felt like, oh man, God, I know that there's a lot of people facing fear right now. There's a lot of people facing anxiety. And God, I want to be used by you. God, use me to show that the peace that you offer in the midst of the craziness of the world. And I felt this big sense of purpose, like I wanted to be used by God. And so I got to, even though we couldn't meet in person, I got on YouTube with my youth group every week, and I would try and share that peace with them. I wrote some messages and recorded these videos that I uploaded on YouTube and Facebook, and I felt this big sense of purpose, but not too long later, it got old. I got bored. I got sick of it. Like, all right, now we're just stuck. Now we're just stagnant. And then, as time went on, I had to cancel a mission trip that we were planning to go to the Bahamas to do hurricane relief work. I had to cancel a youth camp that we do every summer. And I just felt so disappointed. Because year after year, I've seen how God could use these events. Man, we want to go to the Bahamas. They were hit by this horrible hurricane. We want to go there. We want to help. We want to share the love of Christ and the peace and the hope. And now we can't. And this mission, this summer camp every year, we have students come to summer camp, and students accept Christ, and they get baptized, and they get connected with our ministry, and it's just like this big boom going into the next school year. And I just started thinking, we're not going to be able to do this. We're not going to be able to do that. And I spent a little bit of time kind of soaking in this discontentment and this disappointment. And then I had this realization that God hadn't changed, and that God wasn't surprised by any of it. Even though I spent so much time thinking about our trips, God knew from the beginning the trips were never going to happen. God was sovereign over all of it. He knew exactly how long we would be outside of our building. And so maybe God still had a plan. Maybe God still had a purpose for me. Maybe he wanted to use me in a different way than what I was expecting. And I realized that ultimately it was my discontentment that was robbing me of the opportunities that God was placing in front of me. It wasn't that God was unable to move or unable to do things because our trips got canceled and we can't meet in a building. God had not changed. God was not surprised. And this totally changed my mentality. And I found this verse in Proverbs 16, verse 3 recently, and I've read it many times, but when I read it this time, it just really hit me so hard. Proverbs 16, verse 3, commit your work to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Man, I spent so much time planning things that we didn't end up doing. I spent so much time thinking and praying about things that never happened. And I spent a lot of time discouraged because I felt like I was robbed of it. But then I realized God just wanted me to commit my work to him. God just wanted me to keep my eyes on him. and he'll establish the plans. He knew what was happening. He was sovereign over all of it. The coronavirus did not derail the mission of Jesus. My discontentment is what robbed me of those opportunities. And we see that in Paul. Paul's contentment in the midst of his horrible circumstances through the power of Christ is what empowered him to have such a huge impact. The mission continued for Paul despite the horrible circumstances. So instead of saying, God, why did you put me here? Paul said, all right, God, why'd you put me here? See, discontentment is this subtle trap. It's subtle but deadly. The enemy uses it to lead us into ruin. He uses it to lead us in destruction. He wants us to hop on that water slide and plunge us into a pool of destruction. He wants to use it to make you vulnerable to sin. He wants to stunt your spiritual growth, leech on your faith, drain you of hope, rob you of joy. But the good news is that we can find contentment through the strength of Christ. We can find contentment through avoiding the trap of dwelling on the things that we currently lack. We can find contentment through the peace of knowing that our God is sovereign over all. When we cling to the promises of his word, of who he is, when we know he's never going to leave us, he's never going to forsake us. He doesn't promise a perfect world of rainbows and butterflies, but his presence will be with me always. He knows my needs. He's provided for all of his people in the past. He's provided for me. He's not going to drop me now. He will give us our daily bread. When we focus in on the promises of his words, we can find contentment. And we find contentment through keeping our focus on who God is and all that he has provided for us, knowing the crazy love that he has for each and every one of us. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we love you, and God, we thank you for who you are. God, I pray that we would not fall into this trap of discontentment while the enemy uses this subtle trap to just let us to focus in on what the things that we're currently lacking. God, I pray that we would not miss out on your presence around us like the Israelites did. God, that we would constantly keep our focus on worship like they did at the beginning. God, that we would constantly remind ourselves of all the ways that you've come through for us in the past, the ways that you've proven your character to us, and to know just like you didn't lead the Israelites out into the desert to die, maybe you have a plan for us still. When we find ourselves in circumstances that we don't love or feel uncomfortable, God, I pray that we wouldn't run, but God, we would question, God, why do you have me here? What's the purpose? God, I pray that through the strength of Christ, we would be empowered to overcome the adversity, that we would not take the easy way out. God, I pray that we would keep our focus on who you are and all that you've done for us. God, that we would go to your word and cling to the promises of your scripture. Jesus, we love you and thank you for the strength that you give us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, thank you so much for being here this morning, and we'll see you all next week.